My name is Madison Blake. I'm 27 years old and just a few weeks ago, I walked across the stage at Portsville Community College to receive my degree in agricultural technology. I had spent the last 3 years immersed in soil science, hydroponic systems, and sustainable farming innovations, often staying late in the college greenhouse or buried in textbooks that smelled faintly of old paper and fertilizer. My hands had learned to know the difference between nutrient-rich loam and tired, overworked dirt. My mind had grown sharp on the details of crop rotation algorithms and irrigation sensors. But that particular morning, my thoughts were far from textbooks and test results. I was sitting alone on the 6:45 a.m. commuter train to Lexfield, my fingers clenched around the strap of my shoulder bag, trying to keep my breathing steady as the city blurred past the window. I was on my way to an interview at Greencore Dynamics, one of the most innovative firms in agricultural technology across the eastern seaboard. Their vertical farming systems had made headlines, and their latest drone-assisted crop monitoring platform was already being tested in pilot farms throughout the Midwest. Getting a job there wasn't just a career step. It was the one I had stayed up night after night working toward. Even getting an interview had felt like a small miracle. My professors had written glowing recommendations, my GPA was solid, and I had practical experience from a semester-long internship at a local smart farm cooperative. But Greencore was different. They recruited the best. The idea that they had even noticed me still felt a little surreal. The train rocked gently as it sped toward Lexfield, passing through long stretches of pine trees interrupted by occasional clusters of warehouses or roadside diners, the kind that always looked open even when they weren't. I had dressed simply, a dark green blouse tucked into black slacks, clean but sensible shoes, and a canvas coat I'd ironed the night before until every seam lay flat. In my bag was a small leather folder. Inside, a copy of my resume, 2 letters of recommendation, and a printed map of Greencore's campus just in case my phone died or the GPS failed. I had read online that first impressions at Greencore mattered a lot. Their interview process was known to be rigorous but fair. They cared deeply about innovation, adaptability, and ethical sustainability. I had spent the last 3 nights rereading their company mission statement, memorizing the names of their project leads, and rehearsing my answers to every possible interview question I could think of. The train pulled into Lexfield just before 8:30 a.m., and as I stepped off the platform, a wave of warm, humid air wrapped around me. The city was already alive. Traffic lights blinking, taxis honking, clusters of people moving quickly in every direction. Skyscrapers framed the skyline, but the Greencore building stood out, even in a city like this. It was tall, almost entirely glass, with sleek vertical gardens climbing the outer walls. Not decorative but real, thriving agriculture. Tiny sensors blinked like fireflies among the leaves, tracking growth, monitoring moisture. The building itself was alive, a perfect embodiment of everything Greencore represented. As I approached the entrance, my throat tightened slightly. This wasn't just a building. This was a symbol of the future I wanted to be a part of. I passed through a security checkpoint where a cheerful receptionist scanned my ID and handed me a visitor's badge. The lobby was serene, almost silent, filled with soft natural light and the faint scent of mint and lavender from an indoor herb wall near the elevators. It felt more like a botanical sanctuary than a corporate headquarters. I took a deep breath, pressed the button for the 21st floor, and waited as the elevator hummed to life. As I ascended, I tried to push back the creeping doubt. I reminded myself that I had earned this chance. I had worked through weekends, taken on extra credits, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, and poured everything I had into becoming someone capable of contributing to real change in the world of sustainable farming. I wasn't some outsider here. I belonged, or at least I had every right to prove that I could. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by a woman in a charcoal gray suit with a tablet in one hand. She introduced herself as Camille, one of the senior HR coordinators. Her handshake was firm and she smiled in a way that was both professional and genuinely welcoming. She led me down a hallway lined with photographs of successful Greencore projects, solar-fed aquaponic farms in South America, desert reclamation initiatives in North Africa, community-run rooftop farms in urban neighborhoods across the U.S. Every photo told a story and I felt a flicker of pride knowing that I was being considered for a place in that ongoing narrative. We reached a glass-walled conference room and inside were 2 people. One I recognized immediately from my research. Dr. Erin Lin, Director of Sustainable Systems Development. The other was a woman I hadn't seen before, younger, possibly a recent hire. Camille made brief introductions and then left us, closing the door behind her with a quiet click. I sat down, careful to keep my posture upright, my bag tucked neatly by my side. Dr. Lin reviewed my resume for a moment, then looked up, his expression unreadable. And then the questions began. They didn't start with the usual, "Tell us about yourself." Instead, they dove directly into specifics. Detailed scenarios, ethical dilemmas, technical challenges. Dr. Lin asked what I would do if a new soil sensor system showed conflicting readings with manual soil tests on a developing farm. The younger woman followed up by asking how I would balance profitability with community impact when implementing smart irrigation in low-income rural areas. I answered each as clearly and thoughtfully as I could, drawing from my academic background and field experience. My palms were damp, but I stayed steady. I knew these questions weren't just about testing knowledge. They were designed to uncover the way I thought, how I approached uncertainty, how I prioritized values in real-world conditions. The interview stretched to nearly an hour, and by the time we wrapped up, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. Dr. Lin gave a polite nod and said they would be in touch within the week. It wasn't a promise, but something in his tone felt respectful, like I had at least made an impression. As I exited the building, stepping once again into the warm Lexfield morning, the tension in my shoulders finally began to dissolve. I didn't know yet whether this day would mark the beginning of my career or just a stepping stone along the way. But I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I had shown up, I had spoken with clarity and purpose, and I had dared to believe I belonged in that room. And sometimes that was the first, and most important, step on any new path. The morning of my interview began with precision, not panic. I had orchestrated every detail of my routine like a conductor setting the pace for an orchestra. Deliberate, exact, with no allowance for mistakes. The alarm had gone off at exactly 5:30 a.m., though I'd been awake for at least 20 minutes before that, lying still in bed while the early silence of my apartment settled over me like a heavy blanket. My body was already humming with anticipation, my mind rehearsing the structure of the day ahead. I couldn't afford to be spontaneous. There was too much at stake, and I had already invested too much time, too much of myself, into making sure nothing, absolutely nothing, went wrong. I moved through the apartment like a machine programmed for efficiency. In the bathroom, I practiced my opening lines in front of the mirror. Not just the words themselves, but how I would say them. The pacing of my breath, the angle of my posture, the openness of my expression. I adjusted my shoulders, lowered my chin slightly to convey confidence, and tried to soften the tension around my eyes that always tightened when I felt under pressure. I repeated my name, Madison Blake, out loud more times than I cared to admit, until it felt less like a label and more like a carefully chosen brand. After that, I reviewed the list of standard HR questions I'd assembled over the past week. I had them printed out in a small spiral notebook with tabs color-coded by theme. Personal strengths, conflict resolution, leadership experience, ethical challenges, long-term goals. I didn't just read them. I responded to each one in full sentences, out loud, forcing myself to articulate every answer with a mix of clarity and natural tone, even if no one was there to hear me. I stood in front of the kitchen counter, one hand resting on the cool marble surface, the other holding the notebook like a script. Describe a time you had to make a difficult decision under pressure. My voice echoed slightly against the tiled backsplash. I gave myself 15 seconds to respond. No stalling, no second-guessing. I had timed myself the night before and knew that a well-crafted response between 45 and 90 seconds left the best impression. Anything shorter sounded too rehearsed. Anything longer risked sounding disorganized. Once I was satisfied with my verbal responses, I turned to the technical review. This part was less performative and more instinctive. A mental scan of the most relevant systems and technologies I could be asked about. I ran through the basics of automated irrigation management, smart greenhouse climate regulation, nutrient film technique in hydroponics, and the use of machine learning in crop prediction modeling. I quizzed myself silently while I ate a plain breakfast. A boiled egg, whole grain toast, and a glass of water. No caffeine. I didn't trust myself not to shake from a single misplaced shot of espresso. I wanted to stay grounded, centered, controlled. Then came the outfit. I had laid it out 2 days earlier and double-checked it the night before. A charcoal gray blazer with a subtle texture that caught the light only slightly, paired with matching high-waisted trousers that fit comfortably without being too casual. Beneath it, a pale blue blouse with a narrow collar, crisp but not severe. I had chosen the color deliberately. Blue conveys trust, dependability, intelligence. That's what the research said, and I wasn't leaving anything to chance. My shoes were low-heeled, polished to a soft shine, sturdy enough for walking but formal enough to be taken seriously. I had cleaned them the night before with an old cloth and a small bottle of polish that smelled faintly of wax and leather. By the time I was fully dressed, it was only 6:45 a.m. I had more than an hour before I needed to leave, but I couldn't sit still. I paced slowly between the living room and the hallway, checking and rechecking that I had everything. Portfolio folder with documents, a portable phone charger, tissues, breath mints, a printed copy of my resume, and a backup in case of unexpected weather. a small folding umbrella tucked into the side pocket of my bag. I checked the bus schedule again even though I'd already memorized it. I had 2 backup routes mapped out in case of delays, and I'd set an alert for traffic conditions. I had even tested the route the previous weekend, walking from the transit stop to the building just to get a feel for the time and terrain. Every variable that could be controlled, I had accounted for it. What people often misunderstand is that preparation isn't just about knowledge. It's about eliminating the space where anxiety grows. The unknowns, the ifs. The moments when a zipper catches or a shoelace breaks or you forget the name of the interviewer right as you walk through the door. I couldn't eliminate every risk, but I could minimize them to the point where they no longer had power over me. And that was the goal. Not perfection, control. At 7:35 a.m. sharp, I left the apartment. The air outside was cooler than I expected, a faint breeze tugging at the hem of my coat as I walked briskly toward the transit stop. I remember noticing how quiet the street was, how the early sunlight hit the tops of the buildings in long diagonal streaks of pale gold. It felt like a moment suspended in amber, calm but humming with potential energy. I didn't listen to music. I didn't check my phone. I let my thoughts run through one final internal checklist, reviewing the company profile, their recent initiatives, the bios of the people I might meet. I reminded myself of the values they stood for, the language they used in their branding, precision, sustainability, forward thinking. I matched each of those with an example from my own experience, ready to weave it into conversation when the opportunity arose. As I boarded the train that would carry me toward Lexfield, I took one long breath, closed my eyes for just a second, and repeated the words I had started saying to myself days ago, not as a mantra but as a reminder of why I was doing all of this. I've earned this moment. It wasn't just about being good enough for them. It was about recognizing that I had already proven something, to myself if no one else. Every late night, every sacrificed weekend, every small step that had led me here had been intentional, and this moment, the culmination of all of it, was mine to face with open eyes and steady hands. No matter what waited on the other side of that conference room door, I was ready. I had prepared not just for the questions, not just for the environment, but for the weight of the moment itself. And that, I believed, was what made the difference. The bus was already half full when I boarded it, and I chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the front that I wouldn't miss my stop, but far enough back to avoid the noisy conversations that usually hovered around the driver's area. My bag rested on my lap, and I kept glancing out the window as the city slowly passed by in fragments. Brick storefronts, stretches of trees shedding their leaves, old telephone poles lined like sentinels along the roadside. My mind was split between the technical terminology I was silently reviewing and the ticking of my wristwatch, the minute hand inching forward with what felt like mechanical malice. I was still on schedule, but just barely. One delay could tip everything off balance. It was at the 5th stop that the woman stepped onto the bus. She looked to be in her late 60s, maybe older, though her posture made it hard to tell. She was bent forward slightly, shoulders rounded under the weight of a canvas bag slung across her back. Her clothes were well-worn, faded by sun and time, the kind of outfit that spoke of labor, not leisure. There were traces of soil on her hemline, smudges of earth along the seams of her jacket, and her hands were calloused in a way that told me she had worked the ground, not just passed by it. She walked slowly, deliberately, and her eyes, a pale shade of gray-blue, scanned the interior of the bus as if unsure whether she belonged there. When she reached the fare reader, she pulled a small leather coin purse from her pocket, the edges worn soft from years of use. She unzipped it with fingers that moved slowly, maybe stiff with arthritis or just age, and began counting coins, nickels, dimes, a few quarters. I watched from my seat as the pile in her hand grew, then stopped. She looked up at the driver, her voice barely above a whisper, but I could still hear the disappointment in it. She was short by a few dollars. Not cents, dollars. The driver, a man with graying hair and tired eyes, didn't raise his voice, but his tone was flat, unmoved. $20 or you'll have to wait for the next one, he said without even looking at her. Comes in 2 hours. The silence that followed was painful. The woman stood there, motionless for a moment, as if processing the weight of that sentence. 2 hours. In this part of town, that meant standing outside with nowhere to sit, no shelter from the cold air, no guarantee of safety or comfort. I felt a twist in my chest, a slow, aching squeeze that pushed against the back of my ribs. I looked at the time again. If the bus stayed on schedule, I'd reach the interview location with just enough time to walk to the building, take a breath, and compose myself before heading inside. There was no room for error. None. But I couldn't look away. The woman turned slightly, her eyes scanning the bus, and for the briefest moment they met mine. There was no plea in her expression, no silent begging. Just quiet acceptance, the kind that comes from having faced disappointment so often that it no longer surprises. That look did something to me. It cut through the structure of my morning, through the perfectly rehearsed answers and neatly pressed blouse and my carefully polished shoes. None of that preparation meant anything if I could sit there and ignore what was happening in front of me. Without thinking further, I reached into my bag, pulled out my wallet and removed a $20 bill. My fingers trembled slightly as I stood, not because I doubted my decision, but because I knew the cost of it. This small act, this interruption, could undo everything I had worked for. I walked up the narrow aisle and handed the bill to the driver. He gave me a cursory glance, shrugged and printed a receipt. He didn't thank me. He didn't smile. But I didn't care. The woman turned to me startled. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed unsure of what to say. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, overcome by something heavier than gratitude. She nodded once, slowly, and tucked the fare receipt into her coat pocket without another word. I returned to my seat in silence, my heart hammering now not just from stress, but from the raw intensity of the moment. My eyes burned slightly, but I blinked the feeling away, refusing to let emotion undo the focus I had so carefully constructed. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I tried to calm myself by going over technical concepts again, but the words were distant, muffled beneath the echo of that quiet encounter. I had no idea who she was or where she was going. I didn't know what had brought her to that stop, or how often she found herself in that kind of situation. But in those few minutes, our lives had intersected in a way that felt oddly profound. She had not asked for help, but I had given it. And in doing so, I had sacrificed a little of my control, my timeline, my margin for error, for something that felt larger than just one day's ambition. I stared out the window as the city continued to pass, the bus engine rumbling beneath my feet, and I realized that even though my hands were now empty of the $20 I had saved for emergencies, I felt more grounded than I had all morning. Maybe, I thought, the true test of my readiness wasn't just in how well I answered questions or navigated corporate protocols, but in how I responded when life didn't follow the plan. And if that was the case, then I had already passed something more important than any interview. Her name was Delilah. She told me that quietly, almost shyly, after she had settled into the seat directly across from me. Her voice trembled just enough that I had to lean slightly forward to hear her, and when she said it, she smiled through tears that hadn't yet fallen but shimmered just beneath her lashes. I returned the smile as best I could, though inside my stomach had begun to churn with a slow, steady unease that no amount of careful breathing could calm. The weight of what I had just done, the decision I had made with what felt like the most human part of me, was now beginning to compete with the harsh ticking of the clock. I didn't need to look at my watch to know that I was behind schedule. I could feel it in the way the corners of the city blurred past the window faster than I had calculated, in the length of the red lights we were now catching, one after the other, like a silent string of delays I had no power to stop. Delilah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, and for a moment we just looked at one another, not with intensity but with something closer to understanding. Her eyes, glassy with gratitude, scanned my face as if trying to memorize it, as if to mark it into some quiet ledger of kindness she had carried with her for years. I didn't ask her where she was going or why she had no money. It didn't matter. She hadn't asked me for anything and I hadn't expected anything in return. And yet her presence now, her story however untold, was part of mine and we both knew it. But even as I nodded gently in response to her thanks, my mind was beginning to unravel into a spiral of anxious calculations. I had built the morning on a razor-thin margin for error and now that margin was gone. One more traffic jam, one missed turn, one elevator ride that stopped on too many floors and I would arrive late. And I knew what lateness meant in a place like Green Core Dynamics. It wasn't about etiquette. It was about trust, about dependability, about whether you could be counted on when things didn't go exactly as planned. And here I was, choosing kindness over punctuality, humanity over precision, and every fiber of the version of myself I had sculpted for this interview screamed at me that I had just made a catastrophic mistake. But I couldn't regret it. Even as the panic rose like a tide beneath my skin, I reminded myself, over and over like a steady internal chant, that doing the right thing couldn't be wrong. That some decisions carry consequences not because they are flawed but because they are meaningful. That kindness isn't transactional and it isn't convenient, and yet it remains necessary, perhaps even more so when we are at our most focused, our most self-involved, our most career-driven. I didn't know if this moment would cost me the opportunity one had worked toward for so long. I didn't know if the hiring manager would care why I was late, or if I'd even get the chance to explain. But I knew what it meant to me. And that, I told myself, had to be enough. Delilah reached into her coat and pulled out a crumpled paper napkin, blotting her eyes delicately, trying to compose herself. She didn't say much after that, just looked out the window in silence, the tension in her shoulders easing, as if the weight of the morning had lightened even just a little. She looked tired in the way people do when they've had to be strong for far too long, But in that moment she also looked peaceful. And somehow seeing that made it easier for me to breathe. Still, the unease remained, curled up at the base of my spine, stubborn and cold. I pulled my phone from my bag and checked the time, confirming what I already feared. The bus had fallen behind by almost 9 minutes. My transfer stop was approaching and I'd still have to walk 5 blocks to the building. At best, I'd be cutting it close. At worst, I'd arrive after the scheduled time, flustered, breathless, unprepared, the very version of myself I had sworn I would never let them see. But I had made my choice. I had handed over the $20 bill not just because someone needed help, but because something deep inside me refused to look away. I could prepare for interviews, perfect my answers, refine my appearance. But when confronted with a real moment, a raw human moment, I had chosen to act, not to retreat. That had to mean something. That had to count for something. Outside, the sun had risen just high enough to cast long shadows across the buildings. The sky was a pale blue now, streaked with early wisps of cloud, and the city buzzed around us with its usual indifferent rhythm. People walking fast, eyes down, earbuds in, lives moving forward at full speed. And there I sat, suspended between a version of myself I had carefully constructed and another I hadn't expected to meet. One that felt less polished but somehow more real. Delilah turned to me one last time before her stop. She touched her chest lightly, a simple gesture, and whispered, "Thank you. I won't forget this." Then she stood, slowly, her back still slightly bent, and stepped off the bus into the stream of people moving down the sidewalk, swallowed quickly into the crowd. I watched her go, my chest tight, and when the bus pulled away again I looked down at my hands folded over my bag and realized they were no longer shaking. The panic was still there, yes, but beneath it was a quiet certainty, a belief I hadn't expected to feel in that moment, that I had done something right. I had chosen to see someone, truly see them and act. And no matter the cost, that felt more valuable than perfection. I arrived at the Green Core Dynamics headquarters exactly 17 minutes later than I was scheduled to. The time had burned itself into the front of my mind like a scar I could feel with every breath. 17 minutes that carried the weight of weeks of preparation, 17 minutes that unraveled the tight control I had fought so hard to maintain. As I stepped through the revolving glass doors into the expansive lobby, the sterile air conditioning hit my skin like a cold reprimand. The building's vastness stretched upward in steel and glass, sleek and silent, its living walls of vertical greenery casting soft shadows against the white marble floor. The reception desk gleamed and everything around me felt unnervingly still, like I had stepped into a world where time moved differently, a world I was already late for. And there he was. Logan. Standing by one of the wide concrete columns near the reception desk, arms crossed, jaw set in that quiet way that always meant trouble. He wore a tailored blazer, the collar crisp, and his expression gave away nothing at first, until I got closer. His eyes didn't hold concern or relief at seeing me. They held disappointment and worse, frustration that was barely concealed. He hadn't even waited for me to explain. The first thing out of his mouth before I could greet him, before I could even take a full breath, was sharp and flat. 17 minutes, he said, not raising his voice but every syllable slicing clean. I opened my mouth, already prepared with a brief explanation, but he cut me off before I could say anything. "I saw what you did," he continued. "Back on Granger 9th. The old woman. You gave her $20. His tone wasn't inquisitive. He wasn't asking for clarification. He was stating it as a fact and not one he admired. I froze. The realization that he had been there, that he had seen the moment I thought had passed privately between me and a stranger, hit me with an almost physical force. My chest tightened. I tried to say something, anything, but the words died on my tongue. He shook his head slowly, then added in a voice quieter than before, but laced with disapproval so cold it stung. "That was weakness." I couldn't move. For a few seconds, it was like the world narrowed to just that one sentence, that one impossible sentence hovering in the air between us like smoke from something still smoldering. I stared at him, searching his face for irony, for a flicker of humor, for some signal that this was a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse. But there was nothing. Just that steady, unblinking certainty, the kind I had once mistaken for confidence but now recognized for what it really was. Control. Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not in a dramatic shatter, but in a small internal way, like a hairline fracture splitting through a surface you always believed was solid. I thought about everything I had done that morning. The preparation, the discipline, the pressure I had put on myself to be flawless. And then I thought about Delilah. About the way she had looked at me. About how she hadn't asked for anything. About how it had felt to make a decision that wasn't about strategy or ambition, but about compassion. And how, even with the risk it carried, I hadn't regretted it for a second. Now here I was, face to face with someone I had trusted, someone who was supposed to support me, and he was calling that moment that choice a flaw? I managed to say his name quietly, but it didn't come out as a question or a plea. It was more like a pause, a space I gave him in case he wanted to take it back, in case he had realized how hollow and cruel his words sounded in the echo of that pristine lobby. But he didn't. He just looked away briefly, as if this was already settled, as if my values, the core of who I was, were nothing more than inconvenient obstacles on the path he had imagined for me. I turned slightly, not away from him, but enough to reclaim the air around me, to breathe again without choking on the heaviness of his judgment. My hands, still cold from the wind outside, clenched around the strap of my bag, not in fear but in resolve. I wasn't going to defend what I had done. I didn't need to. What shocked me wasn't that he disapproved. It was that he had watched me do something decent and interpreted it as weakness. That spoke volumes about him, not about me. And standing there 17 minutes late, heart racing, makeup barely holding, I realized something more jarring than being off schedule or under pressure. Maybe I had been preparing for the wrong test all along. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. As I sat across the sleek glass table in the softly lit conference room of Green Core Dynamics, with two panelists reviewing my resume and asking carefully structured questions, I could feel a subtle but relentless quiver in my fingers that I couldn't will away. I tried to anchor myself to the surface of the table, pressing my palms gently into my lap, hiding the shaking, but the tension had already settled deep into my body, beneath my skin, beneath the practiced posture, beneath every answer I had spent days rehearsing. The room was quiet, professional, designed to convey innovation and composure, but my thoughts were anything but. Logan's words echoed in my head like a voice that refused to be silenced. That was weakness. I could still see the shape of his face when he said it, the way his mouth barely moved, how easily the judgment slid out of him, like it was objective truth rather than a personal opinion. I had stepped into this building believing in my preparation, in the values I carried with me, but now every question that came my way felt filtered through a new, unshakable doubt. Was kindness really a liability here? Was my instinct to help, to empathize, to choose people over process, fundamentally at odds with the world I was trying so hard to enter? I answered the first question about automated vertical farming strategies almost on autopilot, my mouth forming sentences that my brain barely registered. I could hear myself citing industry statistics, referencing specific soil monitoring systems, describing potential efficiency improvements for water usage, but none of it felt connected. I sounded professional, polished, but hollow. My tone was even, but I knew my voice was thinner than usual, less grounded. I was watching myself perform, detached, as if I had stepped outside my body and was observing someone else wearing my clothes, speaking my lines. Every few seconds, my mind snapped back to that moment in the lobby. Logan's face. The way he looked at me, not with pride or encouragement, but with disapproval, as if I had embarrassed him. As if my humanity had diminished me in his eyes. And it wasn't just the shock of hearing those words. It was what they revealed. That for him, for the people who shaped this company's leadership, values like compassion were negotiable. Maybe even dangerous. If that was true, then what did it say about the company itself? About the culture I was trying to join? One of the interviewers, a woman named Karina with sharp eyes and a calm voice, asked me about a situation where I had to manage conflict between innovation and ethics. My breath caught. Of all the questions, my heart began to beat faster, louder, and I felt heat rise in my chest as I tried to formulate an answer that was honest, that wasn't just another polished reply scraped from my preparation notes. I started speaking slowly, carefully, describing a case study I had worked on in college. A team project where we'd been pressured to cut corners on a nutrient blend prototype in order to meet a grant deadline. I had resisted, advocating for accuracy over speed, and though it had caused tension, in the end our final version had been stronger and safer because of it. I explained this clearly, but all I could think about was the irony. Back then I had been praised for standing up for what mattered. But now, in this chair under these lights, I wasn't so sure anyone here would see it the same way. What if they interpreted that same integrity as inefficiency? What if the very thing I believed in, the thing that defined me, was seen not as a strength but as an obstacle? The more I spoke, the more I began to see the contradictions around me. Green Core's website boasted a mission rooted in sustainability and community impact. They called themselves ethical pioneers. But the words Logan had said, the coldness behind them, suddenly made me question how deep those values truly ran. Was their commitment real? Or was it branding, a layer of greenwashed polish to make profit-driven decisions more digestible? I wanted to believe in this place. I had worked for months to be here. I had dreamed of contributing something meaningful, of joining a team that saw agriculture not just as business but as stewardship. And yet, sitting there with the polished smiles and rigid formats of the interview, I began to wonder if my vision of Green Core had been just that. A vision. An idealized projection of what I hoped the world could be. And worse, I began to wonder what else I had idealized. Logan, for example. His belief in me had once felt like oxygen, quiet, steady support behind the scenes. He had helped me see myself as capable. He had even suggested I apply here. But now I saw the cost of his support more clearly. It came with conditions. I was expected to succeed, yes. But not on my terms. The realization spread through me slowly, a kind of grief. Grief not for the opportunity itself, not yet, but for the version of this day I had once imagined. I had pictured myself sitting in this chair confident, proud, certain of who I was and what I brought. But instead I was fragmented. I was still answering questions, still performing well enough on the surface, but inside I was unraveling. Because something fundamental had shifted. And no amount of perfect answers could change that. By the time the final question came, something about adapting to change in high-stakes environments, I felt like I had lived the answer that very morning. But instead of saying that, I gave another polished story, another case study. Because this wasn't the space for real honesty. Not now. Not yet. Not with Logan's eyes still somewhere in this building. Not while I was still figuring out whether this path, this company, this relationship, still aligned with the person I was trying to be. When the interview ended, I stood, smiled politely, thanked them for their time and walked out with my head held high. But inside I was still shaking. Not just from nerves or fatigue, but from the quiet, growing knowledge that something had fractured, and that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The hallway that led to the HR wing of Green Core Dynamics was lined with frosted glass panels and muted tones of stone and steel, the kind of corporate minimalism that projected power without ostentation. My shoes clicked softly against the floor as I followed the assistant who had come to collect me after the first interview session. She was polite, efficient, and said almost nothing as we moved through the corridor, but I noticed how she glanced at her tablet, then back at me with a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. I tried not to read too much into it. My mind was already too full, with Logan's words, the unease that still clung to my ribs like smoke, the way the morning had spiraled into something far more complex than I could have ever prepared for. When she opened the final door at the end of the corridor and gestured for me to step inside, I did so automatically, drawing a quiet breath and steeling myself for what I expected to be a formal HR debrief. The usual closing questions, a discussion of values, maybe logistics. But as soon as I stepped in, something shifted. The room was warm, softly lit by natural light spilling in from tall windows. The scent in the air was faint but distinct, lavender and cedar, comforting in a strange, almost maternal way. There was a single desk in the center, and behind it sat a woman who rose to greet me. Mrs. Eleanor Carter. I had seen photos of her before. In company literature, in news features, once on Logan's phone, where she appeared at a gala in a sharp black dress, standing beside executives and politicians. But nothing in those images prepared me for the quiet gravity she held in person. Her presence filled the room effortlessly, not with intimidation, but with a calm that made you straighten your back without being told to. She wore a tailored navy suit with a simple silver brooch, and her salt and pepper hair was pinned back in a way that was both elegant and severe. And yet, something tugged at the edges of my awareness. Her face. Her eyes. Her posture. The scent. A bizarre sense of familiarity stirred deep in my chest. That kind of instinctive recognition you get when you see someone out of context and your brain struggles to reconcile it. My breath caught. She extended her hand. "Madison," she said, her voice warm but controlled. "Thank you for coming in." I shook her hand, my own still cold from the nerves that hadn't entirely left me. I sat when she gestured to the chair opposite her. She didn't open a folder or look at a screen. She simply studied me for a moment, hands folded in front of her, as though weighing something more than qualifications. And then she said it. It was me on the bus. I didn't understand at first. My mind tried to fill in the blanks. A misheard word, a metaphor, a reference I was missing. But then she smiled, and the curve of her mouth, the arch of her brow, the shape of her eyes, everything fell into place like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. My throat went dry. I stared at her, frozen, every part of me cycling back through the memory of that morning. The bus. The woman in the worn clothes. The coins. The way she had folded her hands. The way she had looked at me silently. She let the silence sit for a few seconds, then continued, "You seemed surprised. Good. You were not supposed to know." My voice didn't come. My lips parted, but the air caught in my lungs like it didn't know which way to go. My mind was a storm. She had been the woman. Delilah. That wasn't her real name. That wasn't a coincidence. That wasn't a desperate stranger. It had been her. Logan's mother. The HR director. Yes. "A test," she repeated, confirming it out loud as if reading my thoughts. "We have many layers to our recruitment process here. Most of them are not published. This one is designed for certain applicants who are being considered for positions with leadership potential. You were observed from the moment you left your apartment. The words didn't feel real. I struggled to even wrap my mind around them. I blinked, trying to steady myself, trying to locate the edges of what I was hearing. You were on the bus, I finally whispered. That was all planned? She nodded calmly, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes that wasn't control. It was something closer to empathy, or maybe recognition. It was the final variable, she said. We already had your academic records, your technical skills, your professional references. But none of those tell us who you are when no one is watching. When something inconvenient challenges your schedule, your ambition, your control. I could hardly speak. My hands were still now, no longer shaking but cold and motionless in my lap. I tried to find words, but all I could say was, why? She studied me for a moment longer, then leaned slightly forward. Because we don't just build technology here, Madison. We build ecosystems. We work with people who are vulnerable. Small farmers, displaced communities, environments on the brink of collapse. We don't just need brilliance. We need integrity. And compassion. True compassion is impossible to fake under pressure. My pulse was hammering now for a different reason. Everything inside me was shifting again. The chaos, the confusion, the guilt I had carried all morning, the fear that I had jeopardized my future by choosing a person over a timeline, all of it began to unravel and dissolve in her words. The world I had stepped into wasn't what I thought it was. The system wasn't broken. It had just been more layered, more hidden than I had imagined. I looked at her, still stunned. And Logan? Did he know? Her eyes darkened just slightly, but she didn't answer directly. She only said, Logan's path is his own. I wanted to see who you were, without him. There was something final in that. And clarifying. And I understood, not just what had happened but what it meant. I hadn't been late. I hadn't failed. I had shown them the one thing they couldn't find on a resume. And for the first time that day I let go of the tension in my shoulders and finally, quietly breathed. Eleanor sat with an almost unsettling stillness, her hands gently clasped on the polished wood of the desk, her gaze fixed on me with the same calm authority she had held since the moment I entered the room. But now the atmosphere had shifted, not just because of the confession she had made but because of what followed. After the initial shock of learning that the woman I had helped on the bus had been her, that the moment I believed was deeply personal and human had been part of a constructed scenario, she began to explain everything. Every layer. Every decision. She told me without hesitation or apology that Green Core Dynamics regularly conducted what she called empathy assessments, or tests on compassion, as an unofficial but deeply embedded stage of their recruitment process. Not every candidate was subjected to it. Only a select few, those being considered for positions where leadership, visibility, and long-term investment in the company's culture were at stake. She described them clinically, almost methodically, as though they were data-driven exercises rather than emotional gauntlets. There were a variety of tests, she explained. Some involved actors posing as distressed employees in the parking lot, claiming workplace harassment or overwhelming personal crises. Others involved simulated system failures, IT crashes, broken communication lines, or apparent sabotage of internal tools, all designed to observe how the candidate would respond under pressure, especially when the response required empathy rather than efficiency. A few involved planted clients, making unreasonable or emotional complaints, pushing boundaries, provoking frustration. And then there were scenarios like mine, unannounced, unpredictable, designed to happen in public far outside the professional frame where most people know how to perform. Her voice remained composed throughout. She didn't blink when she said that these methods were necessary. That people could fake values, fake sincerity, rehearse ethics in interviews just like they practiced eye contact or handshakes. What we're looking for, she said, is not what you tell us but what you show us, when you think no one is watching. Her eyes never left mine. I sat in stunned silence, my thoughts moving too fast to form coherent reactions. I tried to absorb the logic, to process the reasoning behind it, and yet I couldn't shake the growing sense of discomfort that was spreading through me like a slow, rising tide. I understood the premise on some level. I even recognized the cleverness of it. It was undeniably effective, placing someone in an unpredictable, unguarded moment and seeing how they acted. It cut through performance and exposed instinct. But knowing that I had been watched, evaluated, tested without my consent, knowing that something as intimate as a decision to help a stranger had been orchestrated, scripted, dissected by a panel somewhere, made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not just exposed but betrayed. I looked at her, struggling to find the words for what I was feeling. So it was never real? I asked, my voice low but steady. That moment, it was just data to you? Eleanor didn't flinch. It was real for you. And that's what mattered. The reaction had to be genuine. That's the entire point. But the explanation didn't soothe me. It didn't undo the subtle but deeply personal violation I now felt. Because I hadn't just made a choice that morning. I had made it with my guard down, with my heart exposed, believing I was acting in a space of authenticity, not performance. I had sacrificed something, my timing, my control, my readiness, and I had done it because I believed it was right, not because I thought someone was grading me on a hidden rubric. And now I knew I had been watched, measured, recorded. I understand why you think this is necessary, I said finally, trying to keep my voice even, though I could hear the edge beneath it. I really do. But it doesn't change the fact that it feels manipulative. Like I was tricked into revealing something sacred, something you weren't entitled to just because I applied for a job here. She tilted her head slightly as if studying my reaction in real time. And yet, what you revealed is exactly what we needed to see. If we had asked you directly about your values, would you have told us anything different? No, I answered without hesitation. But I would have chosen to share it. That matters. A silence settled between us, not cold, not hostile, but dense with the weight of conflicting truths. For her, the experiment had worked. It had proven something. For me, it had shattered a boundary I hadn't even known was there. I had believed I was walking into a company driven by purpose, guided by values that aligned with mine. And now I wasn't sure if what I admired was real, or just another carefully designed part of the architecture. What disturbed me most was not just that they had tested me. It was how they had done it without transparency, without acknowledgement of how deeply human such moments are. They had taken something real and turned it into a simulation. And while I had passed by their standards, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something more intimate had been extracted from me without consent. I sat back in my chair, my breath shallow, my thoughts still colliding in every direction. I didn't know what I was going to do yet. Whether I could work in a place where surveillance wore the mask of evaluation, where compassion was measured by manipulation. But I knew one thing clearly. The trust one had arrived with no longer sat beside me. It had been quietly replaced by a sharp and sobering understanding of the price some institutions are willing to pay for certainty, and the things they're willing to take to get it. The door opened without a knock, and before I even turned my head, I knew it was him. Logan walked into the room with the same confident gait I had seen 100 times before. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, voice prepared before he even spoke. But this time everything in me tensed. My breath caught mid-chest as the air in the room seemed to shift again, only this time not with surprise, but with a kind of heavy resignation. I had hoped, somewhere deep in the disoriented part of myself, that I wouldn't have to face him again today. Not after what he'd said to me in the lobby. Not after what had just been revealed. He glanced briefly at his mother, then back at me, and I could tell from the way he closed the door behind him that he wasn't there to observe. He was part of this, and not just by association. There was an unease in his expression, like he already knew what I was feeling before I said anything. I didn't play a role in it, he said immediately, as though trying to preempt the accusation. I wasn't involved in the test itself. I didn't even know which version they'd be running for you. His tone was careful, calculated in that familiar way he used when trying to thread the needle between honesty and control. But that distinction didn't matter to me now. Whether or not he had been wearing a disguise on the bus didn't change the fact that he had known. That he had watched me walk into it blind. You knew. I said, my voice flat. I wasn't asking for confirmation. I was confirming something I already understood, needing only to hear it aloud to make it real. He nodded. Yes. I knew they were planning to test you. He took a small step closer, hands in his pockets, his jaw tightening slightly. That's how they operate. It's standard for high-level candidates. My mother's been refining this system for years. His voice didn't carry shame. There was no remorse in it, only logic. That same measured tone he always used when talking about business decisions, metrics, or performance strategy. As if morality was just another variable to be weighed. And you didn't tell me? My throat tightened as the words left me, not with anger but with a kind of quiet devastation. You let me walk into it. You watched. His brow furrowed, and for the first time, there was something that looked like frustration on his face. I couldn't tell you, Madison. That would have compromised the outcome. The whole point is to see who you are when no one's watching. It has to feel real. But you were watching, I said, my voice suddenly sharper than I meant. And you judged me for it. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. He hesitated just for a second before speaking again. What I said earlier. That was my opinion. My reaction. It had nothing to do with the test itself. No, I cut in, rising from my seat, my palms flat on the armrests for balance. It had everything to do with it. Because the way you saw me in that moment, the way you looked at me when I gave that woman money, that was real, Logan. That wasn't an act. That was you. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. Instead, he looked at me and said without flinching, "This world doesn't reward softness. You know that. You can't let emotion get in the way of judgment. Sometimes helping one person means putting your future at risk, and most people won't do that. It's inefficient." I stared at him in silence, stunned by how calmly he said it, how convinced he was that this philosophy was not only reasonable but necessary. He didn't see the problem. He believed in the system, the deception, the manipulation, the calculated engineering of emotional stress. To him it was just strategy. "I'm not most people," I said quietly, but the words felt like they were coming from somewhere deeper than my voice, like they were pulling away from him, creating distance even as we stood in the same room. "I know you're not," he replied, taking a step closer. "That's why they tested you. Because you might actually be right for this place." But for me, that sentence didn't land as a compliment. It landed like a warning. If this was what being right for Green Corps meant, if passing meant betraying your own boundaries without even realizing it, then maybe I didn't belong here after all. And worse, maybe Logan had never seen me for who I was. Maybe he had only seen potential, not personhood. Capability, not conscience. He kept talking, trying to explain the logic behind the methods, the outcomes, the success rates. But I had stopped listening. I stood there, watching the way he moved, the way his eyes avoided mine when they got too sharp, and I realized something I should have seen much earlier. His values and mine had never aligned. I had been so busy fitting myself into his world, into his expectations, into the company that bore his mother's name, that I hadn't noticed where I was losing pieces of myself. When he finally paused, expecting some reply, some recognition of the reasonableness of it all, I said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. He had drawn a line, not just with his words in the lobby but again now. He believed kindness was weakness. He believed trust had to be earned through deception. And I believed the exact opposite. That was the red line. And now I could see it clearly. The moment the door opened again, the sound of heels striking the tile floor sharp and sure, I knew it could only be one person. Vivian Carter stepped into the room like she owned it, and in many ways she did. She had the posture of someone used to taking control the second she entered a space. Her dark tailored suit fit flawlessly, not a thread out of place, and her presence radiated that familiar chilling authority that came not from loudness, but from precision. She didn't hesitate. She didn't smile. She simply closed the door behind her and walked toward us with the kind of quiet power that silences rooms without needing to ask. Logan turned slightly, acknowledging her with a glance, but said nothing. Eleanor didn't move either. It was as if this had all been expected. Another piece of choreography in a script I hadn't known I was in. Vivian stopped in front of the desk and looked at me directly, not as an equal, not even as a candidate, but as someone under examination. Her expression was unreadable, all edges and calculation, and before she spoke, I already knew whatever she had come to say wasn't going to bring comfort. "I was the one who coordinated the test," she said without hesitation, without preamble, her voice smooth but lacking any warmth. "From the time of the bus's arrival to the stop we chose. From the coat Eleanor wore to the amount of money she would appear to be short." She tilted her head slightly, watching my face as if studying every micro-reaction, like I was a live experiment. Every variable was deliberate. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Something inside me had already begun to harden. The last thread of disbelief I had been holding, the hope that maybe this hadn't been as orchestrated as it seemed, snapped under the weight of her words. "It wasn't about you personally," she continued, as if that were some kind of assurance. "We've used this format before with variations. Sometimes it's a mother with a child who can't afford a ticket. Sometimes it's someone who drops their groceries in front of a candidate. We watch. We take notes. We review footage. We assess decisions under stress, distraction, unpredictability." Her tone was so clinical, so devoid of emotional texture that it felt surreal. She was describing the manipulation of human empathy with the same detachment someone might use to explain product testing or weather simulations. And what disturbed me most was how natural it seemed to her. "This is not a game," she added, her voice firm, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And it's not a morality play. It's a filter. A way of protecting the company from people who might crumble under the weight of ethical pressure or sentimentality when stakes are high. We're not playing God." Her lips curled just enough to imply disdain for anyone who might dare think otherwise. "This is survival. This is what it takes to stay ahead in a market that eats idealists alive." The room felt smaller after she said it, the air thicker. Her words didn't come with apology or even pride. They came with the coldness of absolute conviction. To her this wasn't controversial, it was practical. Necessary. Efficient. And worse, it was normal. I looked at her, at Logan, at Eleanor, the three of them standing like a unified front, a family of strategists who had turned morality into a metric, who didn't blink at the idea of controlling not just the environment, but the emotions of the people moving through it. It wasn't just a corporate strategy. It was a culture. A family legacy. One I had unknowingly walked straight into. Vivian's gaze stayed locked on mine, daring me to question it. Maybe even hoping I would. But I didn't speak. I just sat with the weight of it all. The manipulation, the surveillance, the fact that every feeling I had experienced on that bus, every moment of internal struggle, every heartbeat I had sacrificed to do what I believed was right, had been turned into a calculation on someone else's clipboard. I realized then that this wasn't just about a test. It was about power. About who gets to define what strength is. About who decides which values matter in the spaces where decisions are made. They had decided that kindness was only acceptable if it passed a certain threshold of strategic usefulness. That empathy could be permitted, but only if it was unshakable, unplanned, and quantifiable. To them I had passed. But to me it felt like something sacred had been trespassed. Not because I had helped someone, but because they had used that moment, that vulnerability, without permission, without dignity, without care. I was no longer unsure. I wasn't confused anymore. I understood exactly where I stood, and exactly where they did. Something in me snapped, not violently but cleanly, like a thread pulled too tight for too long, finally giving way under its own tension. The air in the room had become unbearable, too thick with words dressed as logic, too full of control wrapped in the language of care. I couldn't sit in that chair 1 second longer, couldn't watch them standing there, convinced of their own righteousness while speaking about manipulation as if it were policy, as if the bending of people's emotions was just another checkbox in the hiring process. I rose to my feet with a steadiness that surprised even me. My heart was pounding, not with fear or panic anymore, but with clarity, hard and bright and undeniable. My voice came out firm, no tremor, no apology. I didn't care how many titles they held, how well-rehearsed their reasoning was, or how many systems they had built to test the limits of human instinct. They had crossed a line, and I was finally done pretending that I could live with it. No, I said simply at first. Just that. One syllable. But it carried everything I had been holding in. The pressure, the confusion, the grief of realizing what kind of world I had stepped into. I'm not accepting the job, I continued, locking eyes with Eleanor first, then Vivian. And I'm done pretending that any of this is okay. That the way you treat people, real people, as test subjects is somehow noble because you frame it as protecting your company's values. What values? I could feel my voice rising, not from rage but from resolve. This isn't about empathy. It's about control. It's about seeing how far you can push someone and still keep your hands clean. I turned to Logan then. He was silent, tense, his jaw tight, arms crossed like he didn't know whether to argue or let me go. And in that moment I saw everything I needed to. Not just the disappointment in his eyes, but the absence of understanding. He still believed this was all justified. He still thought this was strength. And you, I said to him, my voice quieter but sharper than it had been all day. You watched me break myself in half trying to be good enough for this place. For you, and you called it weakness. I won't let anyone twist that part of me into a flaw. Not even you. There was a silence after that. A deep one. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't owe them my silence or my explanations anymore. I picked up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked past them with my head held high. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last, not because I doubted my decision, but because walking away from something you worked for, something you believed in, hurts even when you know it's the right thing. I didn't look back. Not when I opened the door. Not when it clicked shut behind me. My chest was tight and my eyes burned, but I kept walking. Through the corridor, past the glass offices, down the elevator, out into the street where the cold air hit me like a baptism. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time that day I felt free. I had walked into that building prepared to prove my worth. I walked out having defended something much more important. My dignity. And no title, no opportunity, no carefully engineered illusion of belonging was worth trading that away. 2 weeks after I walked out of Green Core Dynamics, I filed a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. I had spent several days gathering everything I could. Notes, memories, time-stamped messages, even details from public documents that confirmed patterns in their recruitment practices. It wasn't just about what they had done to me. It was about the systemic nature of it, the deliberate, orchestrated testing of candidates without consent, the psychological manipulation hidden under the guise of evaluation. I described the false scenario on the bus, the secret observation, the fact that it was planned and executed by senior leadership, including the HR director herself. I documented how their process created an environment of coercion and emotional exploitation, and I emphasized that the candidates were never informed or asked for permission. What started as a complaint quickly turned into a formal investigation. Within days, I was contacted by federal investigators. They asked questions, specific, sharp, informed. It turned out I wasn't the first person to raise concerns, only the first to come forward with enough clarity, detail, and a willingness to put my name on the record. The deeper they looked, the more they uncovered. The so-called compassion tests weren't isolated events. They were institutionalized procedures, coordinated at the executive level and implemented across multiple departments. There were internal emails, scripting templates, logs, even surveillance footage used for internal discussion, stored under innocuous project code names. The company had built a system around deception and called it innovation. The EEOC cited Green Core Dynamics for multiple violations: unethical hiring practices, invasion of privacy, psychological testing without consent, and discriminatory evaluation procedures. The fine was $50,000. For a company of their size, it was a financial slap on the wrist. But the damage went far beyond the monetary. When the news broke, it spread fast. Industry blogs picked it up first, then national outlets. Headlines used phrases like morality theater, surveillance disguised as strategy, and testing or trauma. My name appeared in some of the articles, not because I sought publicity but because my account was too central to ignore. Public response was immediate. Some people, especially those who had applied or worked at Green Core in the past, came forward with their own experiences. Interviews that felt strange, overly pressured, or inexplicably personal. The company issued a carefully worded statement denying wrongdoing while reassessing internal processes. But the language rang hollow. The damage to their reputation was already done. Their image, once rooted in sustainability and ethics, was now tangled in controversy and manipulation. Internally, changes came quickly. Logan was dismissed within days of the story breaking. According to reports, it wasn't just because of his role in defending the testing system, it was because his private messages, leaked anonymously, showed clear support for the practices and disdain for candidates who led with emotion. His tone mirrored exactly what I had experienced in the lobby. Cold, pragmatic, detached from the values the company claimed to champion. Eleanor Carter was quietly removed from all hiring responsibilities. She remained with the company in a limited advisory capacity, but her role in designing and endorsing the empathy experiments had become too toxic to ignore. No amount of internal justification could shield her from the public eye once the story reached national platforms. Vivian, perhaps the most calculating of them all, was named interim CEO. Whether this was an attempt at internal damage control or simply a move to contain fallout within the Carter family, no one could say for sure. What was clear was that Green Core was bleeding credibility, and their leadership was scrambling to patch the holes before the company's partnerships and contracts began to collapse under scrutiny. I watched all of it unfold with a strange combination of grief and affirmation. There was no triumph in it for me. I hadn't wanted destruction. I had wanted change. I had wanted them to see how wrong it was to strip away dignity from people under the illusion of evaluation. But change doesn't always come gently. Sometimes it has to be forced into the light. In the end, I didn't celebrate their fall. I didn't take pleasure in their scandal. But I stood by what I had done. I had chosen integrity over advancement. I had spoken when it would have been easier to walk away. And I had done it not to destroy a company but to draw a line, for myself and for anyone else who had ever been made to feel small for choosing kindness. After everything, when the storm around Green Core Dynamics hadn't yet subsided, but was already unstoppable, my phone barely stopped ringing. I was invited to broadcasts, asked to give interviews. Journalists, ethics consultants, union representatives, even ordinary people just like me, sent letters seeing something personal in this story. Some just wanted to say thank you, others shared their pain, their stories that had remained unspoken for years. People who had been rejected in interviews because they were too emotional, not strategic enough, or had failed to handle stress. People who, like me, had chosen humanity, and paid for it with silence, lost opportunities and doubts about their own worth. In every letter, in every message I felt it. What I did was not a mistake. What I did then, when I reached out to a person who looked exhausted without thinking about the consequences, without any desire to look heroic, was real. And that's why it mattered. Not because of the banknote. Not because of a spontaneous gesture. But because I made a choice at a moment when no one told me it was a choice. That was where the truth lay. And truth, even when it is unexpected or uncomfortable, has power. It moves systems when they begin to rot under the weight of their own cynicism. I thought about that morning on the bus again and again. How my heart was pounding in my chest, how the clock mercilessly squeezed every minute, how I knew I could lose the chance I had fought for years. And yet I didn't walk past. I didn't do anything grand. I simply did what I believed was right. And now, looking back, I understood. That simple act set in motion a chain of events that revealed far more than I could have ever imagined. The system that hid behind its values was, in fact, manipulating kindness, reducing it to a script. It believed it could measure sincerity. But sincerity doesn't fit into Excel spreadsheets, doesn't show up in performance ratings. Cannot be faked, and it cannot be summoned on command. It either exists or it doesn't. And if my example, just one drop in the ocean, managed to give a voice to those who were forced into silence, to show that kindness is not weakness but strength, then perhaps it all had meaning. In a world where honesty has become rare, where the masks of skills often hide the emptiness of intent, genuine kindness becomes the greatest threat to a deceitful system. Because it doesn't play by the rules, it refuses to recognize them. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply acts. And I will never again let anyone convince me that this was a mistake. I don't regret helping Delilah. I don't regret taking $20 out of my wallet at a moment when I had other plans, other priorities, other goals. And I don't regret losing the job I had prepared for so long, the one that had kept me up at night studying courses, building projects, practicing interviews. Because in the end I gained something far more important than a position or a line on a resume. I gained myself. And respect for myself. Quiet, internal, solid as stone. Not the kind you need to earn in the eyes of others, not the kind you can hold on to with praise or promotion, but the kind that appears when you refuse to betray yourself even under pressure. I've spent a long time rethinking that day, that situation, that phrase that cut so deep. It's weakness. And now I know with absolute certainty, it wasn't my weakness. It was theirs. Weakness is being afraid of compassion. Weakness is hiding morality behind procedure. Weakness is living in a system where kindness must be justified as an exception, not accepted as a norm. I'm not ashamed that I showed humanity. I'm ashamed that someone had the cynicism to call it a selection tool. That choice, made in a single second, without preparation, without guarantees, without knowing anyone was watching, turned out to be my real test. But not to be graded. To let me see with my own eyes who I am. And if after that I didn't get an office, a salary, or a new badge, but gained clarity instead, that's a fair trade. I'd rather stay true to myself than become convenient for a system that turns a heart into an algorithm. People asked me whether I was afraid other companies would treat me with suspicion. Whether I regretted damaging my connections, my contacts, my prospects. But what is a prospect, really, if along the way you lose the ability to see the human in another person? I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know, in every field, even the harshest one, there's room for those who haven't broken. For those who never learned to stay silent when they should speak. For those who don't see kindness as a compromise. And if someone else ever finds themselves trapped in a system that calls manipulation a test, I want them to know this. The real trial isn't for them. It's for those who invent it. Because being kind is nothing to be ashamed of. Being kind isn't weakness. It's strength. It's a weapon. And when the world starts treating kindness as a threat, it means it's working.